Let's get started. Story number 1.
It was a late October evening when I first experienced the feeling that something was terribly wrong in the old farmhouse I had rented for a few weeks. I had needed a change of scenery, something quiet to help me get away from the chaos of city life. The farmhouse, perched at the edge of a small, sleepy town, seemed perfect. It was far enough from the bustle to offer peace, but close enough to the town that I wouldn't feel completely isolated. The house itself had a charm to it. It was weathered and old, with wooden floors that creaked underfoot and windows that rattled when the wind blew too hard. The landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Spencer, had warned me about the house's age, but assured me it was perfectly safe. He mentioned the house had been in his family for generations, though he didn't talk much about the history. It seemed normal enough. I was fine for the first few days, enjoying the solitude and quiet. I spent my mornings hiking the nearby trails, exploring the woods that surrounded the property. The afternoons were spent reading and journaling by the large fireplace in the living room. It felt peaceful, almost idyllic. But by the 5th day, things began to feel off. It started with the sounds. At first, I thought they were just the usual noises that old houses make, creaking beams, the house settling with the wind. But over time, the sounds began to become more distinct. Soft footfalls on the wooden floors above me when I was alone in the house. A door closing when I knew I hadn't touched it. A faint tapping, like someone gently knocking on the walls. I tried to brush it off, blaming it on the house's age or my overactive imagination. But it wasn't long before the feelings of unease began to grow. One evening, after returning from a hike, I entered the house to find the kitchen door open. I distinctly remembered locking it before I left, but there it was, wide open. I didn't hear anyone outside, and there were no signs of forced entry. At first, I thought maybe I'd forgotten to lock it, but then I realized that wasn't like me. I never left the doors unlocked. I stepped inside, cautiously shutting the door behind me. As I walked toward the kitchen, I noticed something else. The kitchen light, which I was certain I had turned off before I left, was now on. I stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to reason with myself. Maybe I had forgotten to turn it off, or maybe I had just imagined the whole thing. But as I scanned the kitchen, I saw the small details that told me something had been disturbed. A chair slightly pulled out from the table, a cabinet door ajar, and the most unsettling of all, an empty glass sitting on the counter, one that I was sure I had never used. I tried to shake it off, dismissing it as my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I had been hiking for hours and was probably just tired. But that night, as I lay in bed, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. I pulled the covers tightly around myself, trying to ignore the strange feeling in the air. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing noises, soft whispers, the sound of footsteps in the hallway, the unmistakable rustle of someone moving around just outside my bedroom door. When I would open my eyes, the hallway would be empty, the house still. The next day, I went into town to get some supplies, hoping a little change of scenery would shake the strange feeling I had. I stopped at the local store and ran into a few of the townsfolk. Most were friendly, though there was a sense of wariness in their eyes when they noticed I was staying at the farmhouse. "Old Spencer's place, huh?" One of the older men, his face weathered with age, said when I mentioned where I was staying. "That place has a history. Not many folks like to go near it, if they're being honest." I raised an eyebrow, trying to sound casual. "What do you mean? It seems like a nice place." "Peaceful." The man paused, glancing around before leaning in slightly, his voice dropping low. "You'd be better off asking Spencer about it. It's not my place to talk about it, but just keep your wits about you while you're there." I left the store with more questions than answers, the unease from the night before still gnawing at me. That evening, as I sat in front of the fireplace, the house seemed to grow quieter. The air felt heavy, as if something was pressing in around me. I tried to distract myself with a book, but my eyes kept flicking to the hallway outside the living room, as if I were expecting someone or something to appear. Around midnight, I heard it again. The soft footfalls, unmistakable, as though someone was walking across the floor above me. I had no explanation for it. I had already checked the house, making sure all the windows and doors were locked before going to bed. But the sound persisted, slow and deliberate, echoing in the silence of the house. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up the stairs, the beam of light cutting through the darkened hallway. As I reached the top, the house seemed to grow even quieter, as if holding its breath. The footsteps had stopped. I checked the first room on the left, empty. Then the next room, also empty. I turned toward the last room, a small guest bedroom that I hadn't yet bothered to open. The door was slightly ajar, and as I approached, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something about the room, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, that made my heart race. I pushed the door open, and the beam of the flashlight fell across the room. At first, it seemed normal, an old with a quilt draped across a rocking chair in the corner, and a dresser against the far wall. But then I noticed it. A figure standing in the far corner of the room, obscured in shadow. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was still, too still, and yet it was unmistakable. It was a man, or at least it seemed to be. But there was something wrong about him. His body was too rigid, his posture unnaturally stiff, as if he were frozen in place. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. For a long moment, I stood there, staring at the figure, frozen in fear. Then, as if waking from a trance, I turned and bolted from the room, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I didn't dare look back. That night, I locked myself in the bedroom, refusing to leave the safety of the bed. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. The next morning, I packed my things. I couldn't stay another night in that house, not with the feeling of being watched and the unsettling presence I had felt. As I walked out the door, I glanced back at the old farmhouse one last time. The wind had picked up again, sending the trees swaying in a way that almost seemed deliberate. I didn't look back as I drove away, the memory of the figure still fresh in my mind. A few days later, I received a letter from Mr. Spencer. He apologized for the strange happenings in the house, explaining that it had a long history, one that was best left untouched. He mentioned that several families had rented the house over the years, but none had stayed long. The house, it seemed, had its own way of making people leave. And so I left it at that. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something or someone was waiting for me in that farmhouse and that it didn't want me to stay. Story the end.
Story number 2.
When Evelyn moved into her new apartment, she thought it was a fresh start. It wasn't fancy, just a small one-bedroom on the third floor of an older complex, but it was hers. After breaking up with her boyfriend and leaving their shared place, she was eager to be on her own. The first few weeks were uneventful. She settled into a routine, decorating the space to her liking, working late at the publishing office, and unwinding with a glass of wine and a book before bed. But then, things started to feel off. It began with little things. The feeling of being watched when she was home alone. Her cat, Juniper, staring at the corner of the room with wide, unblinking eyes, refusing to go near it. One night, she came home to find her bathroom door closed. She was sure she had left it open that morning. When she pushed it open, the mirror was fogged up, as if someone had just taken a hot shower. The next night, it was the kitchen cabinets. She woke up to find 3 of them wide open. She would have blamed it on the cat, but Juniper was curled up beside her all night. She tried to ignore it, chalking it up to stress or an overactive imagination. She worked long hours. Maybe she was just forgetting things. Then came the whispers. It was late, past midnight, when she first heard them. A soft, hushed conversation just outside her bedroom door. She froze, her heart hammering. She strained to listen, but the words were too quiet, just barely audible. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, stepping cautiously into the hallway. Nothing. The apartment was empty. She checked the locks. Both the front door and the windows were shut tight. Still, she didn't sleep that night. Over the next few weeks, the whispers continued, sometimes faint, like someone speaking from another room. Other times, right behind her, so close that she could feel breath on the back of her neck. But there was never anyone there. One night, Evelyn decided to record the sound. She set her phone to record while she slept, leaving it on the nightstand. When she listened to it the next morning, she nearly dropped her phone. At first, it was just normal nighttime sounds, her shifting in bed, the occasional hum of traffic outside. But at 3:14 a.m., something changed. A creak, the sound of footsteps, and then a voice. Soft whispering. It was impossible to make out at first, but after listening to it over and over, Evelyn picked up a single phrase. Come see. She deleted the recording immediately. That day, she called her landlord. She tried to keep her voice steady, explaining that she had been hearing strange noises at night, that she wanted to know if there was any history to the apartment. The landlord hesitated. Finally, he sighed. The last tenant left in a hurry, he admitted. Said the place was strange. Evelyn pressed him for more, but he refused to elaborate. If it makes you uncomfortable, you can break your lease early, he offered. She considered it, but moving was expensive. She had spent her savings getting into this place. So instead, she tried to ignore it, tried to pretend everything was fine, until the night she saw it. She had been reading in bed, Juniper curled up on her chest when the cat suddenly tensed, her ears flattened, her body rigid. Then in a blur of motion, she bolted off Evelyn's lap and hid under the bed, growling. Evelyn barely had time to react before she heard it. A creak. From the closet. Her blood ran cold. Slowly, heart pounding, she turned her head. The closet door was open. Just a crack. She knew for a fact it had been closed before. She stared at it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Then, the door moved. Just slightly, barely an inch. But enough. Enough for her to see something inside. A shape, a figure. Tall, thin, standing in the dark, watching. Evelyn's stomach dropped. She scrambled off the bed, grabbing her phone with shaking hands, and turned on the flashlight. The second the light hit the closet, nothing. The space was empty, but she knew what she saw. Juniper refused to come out from under the bed for hours. That night, Evelyn slept with the lights on. The next morning, she decided she needed to get out, just for a few days, just long enough to clear her head. She packed a bag and called her sister, planning to stay with her for the weekend. But as she was leaving, she noticed something. The mirror in the hallway. It was dusty. She hadn't cleaned it since moving in. But in the thin layer of dust, there was something strange. A handprint. Too large to be hers. And it was on the inside of the glass. She didn't stay another night. She spent the weekend at her sister's, debating whether to go back at all. On Sunday, she finally worked up the nerve to return, just to grab the rest of her things. She would break the lease, find another place, leave it all behind. But when she unlocked the front door, something was different. The apartment was freezing. The air smelled wrong, stale, rotten. She stepped inside, cautiously looking around. Everything seemed normal. Until she noticed the bedroom door. It was closed. She never closed it when she left. A sick feeling formed in her stomach. She stepped closer, her fingers trembling as she reached for the handle. She pushed it open. Her suitcase was in the middle of the room, the one she had packed before leaving, and it was open. Clothes had been pulled out, strewn across the floor. But that wasn't the worst part. No. The worst part was what was sitting on her pillow. Her phone. The screen was on. A voice recording was open. Her heart nearly stopped. Slowly, barely breathing, she picked up the phone and pressed play. At first, silence. Then, breathing. Slow. Deep. Then a voice. Right next to the microphone. You can't leave. Evelyn dropped the phone and ran. She never went back. She never even returned for her things. A month later, she received a call from the landlord. He said the new tenant had already moved out. Said they'd heard whispering at night. Felt like something was watching them. Evelyn didn't respond. She just hung up. And she never spoke about the apartment again. But sometimes, late at night when she's lying in bed, she swears she hears it. Soft. Right at the edge of hearing. A whisper. Come see. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I never considered myself superstitious. Ghosts, demons, curses, just stories. Things to scare kids or entertain thrill seekers. But one night, deep in the backwoods of West Virginia, I learned that some things can't be rationalized. It was late October, the kind of cold where the air has teeth. My friend Ryan and I had been hiking for most of the day, pushing through the dense, brittle trees that rattled like bones in the wind. We weren't amateurs, but we weren't experts either. The goal was a weekend of camping away from everything. No phones, no people, just the wilderness. By dusk, we had our tent set up near a small clearing with a fire crackling between us. We had a couple of beers, shared dumb stories, and watched the flames eat away at the dry logs. Everything felt normal. Peaceful, even. Then we heard it. A sound, distant but unmistakable. A whistle. Not random notes, but a tune, deliberate and eerie. It carried through the trees, rising and falling before fading into silence. Ryan laughed, tossing a pebble into the fire. Probably just some hunter messing around, he said. But my gut twisted. This far out? He shrugged. Maybe a ranger? I didn't push it. I wanted to believe that too. An hour passed, the wind had picked up, and the fire danced wildly. We were settled in, dozing off in our chairs when the whistle came again. Closer this time. Ryan sat up straight. Okay, that was weird. I didn't answer. I was straining to hear, waiting for it to come again, and it did. Closer still. Then, crunching footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the darkness just beyond the firelight. Hello? Ryan called out. His voice was steady, but I could tell he was uneasy. No response. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the trees. Nothing. Just shifting shadows and the endless expanse of tangled branches. We didn't say much after that. We doused the fire and climbed into the tent, zipping it up tight. The fabric felt like paper, a fragile barrier between us and whatever was out there. I lay awake for what felt like hours, listening. The wind howled. Leaves rustled. The occasional crack of a distant branch breaking made my heart hammer. Then, at some unknown hour, deep into the night, the whistling returned. It was right outside our tent. I held my breath. My hands clenched into fists so tight my nails dug into my palms. The tune was clearer now, almost playful. Ryan shifted beside me. I felt him grab my arm. Dude, he breathed. Then the zipper of our tent started to move. My body locked up. It was slow, deliberate, the faint, metallic rasp filling the silence. Ryan grabbed his knife and shot up. Hey! He bellowed, shoving at the tent wall. Everything went still. Then rapid footsteps, running, disappearing into the trees. We burst out of the tent, shining our flashlights in every direction. The forest was empty, quiet except for the wind. That was enough for us. We packed in record time, stuffing our gear into our packs with shaking hands. We didn't talk. We just moved. The hike back was brutal. The sun wasn't even up yet, and the winding trails looked foreign and endless in the dark. Every crunch of a leaf sent spikes of fear through me. Every shadow looked like it was watching. We made it back to the car just as dawn broke. We drove in silence until we reached town, stopping at a diner just to feel human again. As we sat there, sipping bitter coffee, Ryan spoke. You saw it, right? I didn't answer immediately. I didn't want to, but I had. Just before we left the campsite, when I swung my flashlight one last time toward the trees. 2 eyes, low to the ground, too far apart to be human, watching us, and smiling. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The last time I saw my best friend Hannah was a week before she disappeared. We met for coffee at a little shop near her apartment, something we'd done every Sunday morning for years. She looked tired, which wasn't unusual. She worked long hours at the hospital, pulling double shifts whenever she could. But that day, there was something different about her. Her hands trembled when she picked up her cup, and she kept looking over her shoulder, scanning the cafe like she was expecting someone to be there. What's wrong? I asked. She forced a smile. Nothing. Just haven't been sleeping well. I didn't believe her. I pressed, and eventually she sighed and leaned in. I think someone's been in my apartment, she whispered. A chill ran through me. What do you mean? She hesitated. Little things. My closet door will be open when I know I closed it. I hear sounds at night, like someone walking around, but when I check, nothing's there. I frowned. Maybe it's the neighbors? She shook her head. It's inside. I hear it moving in my room. I stared at her. Have you called the police? She let out a humorless laugh. What would I tell them? That my socks aren't where I left them? I didn't know what to say. Hannah had always been level-headed, logical, not someone who got spooked easily. I told her she could stay at my place if she felt unsafe, but she waved it off. It's probably just in my head, she said. Work's been stressful. I just need sleep. I wish I had insisted, because a week later she was gone. She didn't show up for work, didn't answer her phone. I drove to her apartment. The door was locked, no sign of forced entry. But when her landlord let me in, I knew something was wrong. The place was spotless, too clean. Her bed was made, her laundry was folded, her dishes were stacked neatly in the drying rack. It looked staged, like someone had erased all evidence that she lived there. But the worst part was the closet. I opened the door, and inside, every single one of her clothes was missing. Every hanger was bare. The police treated it like a missing person case. They searched her apartment, interviewed neighbors, checked security footage. Nothing. No sign of struggle. No forced entry. It was like she had just vanished. Weeks passed, then months, no leads, no updates. Eventually, people stopped talking about it, but I never stopped looking. I kept searching online, reading missing person reports, combing through forums. Then, 6 months later, I found something. A post on an obscure message board. Has anyone heard of The Watcher? I clicked. It was a thread full of stories, people claiming they had experienced the same thing. Small changes in their homes. Closet doors open when they were sure they'd closed them, the feeling of being watched. Then one day, they disappeared. One user described something that made my blood run cold. They said that right before their friend vanished, they had found something hidden in their bedroom. A camera. Inside their closet. Recording. My stomach twisted. I remembered Hannah's empty closet. Had she found one too? I went back to her apartment. The new tenants had already moved in, but I begged them to let me look around. I went straight to the closet. At first, there was nothing, but then I ran my fingers along the top shelf, feeling for anything unusual, and I found it, a small hole, almost invisible. A camera had been there. Someone had been watching her, recording her. And when she found out, they took her. I went to the police with what I found, but they didn't take me seriously. They said there was no evidence, no proof. I tried to track down the people from the forum, but the site had been deleted. Every post, gone. Hannah's case remains open, but I know the truth. She didn't just disappear. Someone took her, and whoever they are, they're still out there, still watching, still waiting for the next person. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I never used to believe in the supernatural. My whole life, I prided myself on logic, on finding reasonable explanations for things. If I ever got spooked, I would remind myself that fear is just the mind's way of filling in gaps when information is missing. But then I spent a winter living alone in a house that didn't want me there. I was in my mid-20s and going through a rough time. A bad breakup, job stress, a growing feeling that I was just stuck. My uncle owned a small cabin in upstate New York, a 2-story place near the woods. He used it as a summer retreat, but said it sat empty in the winter. When I told him I needed time away, he offered to let me stay there for a few months. It sounded perfect. Peace, isolation, time to think. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I worked remotely, hiked when the weather allowed, and spent the evenings reading by the fireplace. It was quiet, peaceful. Then the noises started. At first, they were easy to brush off. Soft creaks in the floorboards, the occasional thud from the roof. Old houses settle, I told myself. Maybe there was a raccoon in the attic. But one night, I was jolted awake by something different. Not a creak, not the wind. It was the sound of footsteps. Inside the house, I lay there, heart pounding, holding my breath. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Moving across the floor downstairs, I reached for my phone, but my hands were shaking. My brain kept trying to rationalize. Maybe the wind shifted something. Maybe I imagined it. Then the sound came again. A step. Another. Moving toward the stairs, I forced myself to sit up, listening. Silence. I told myself it was a dream, and eventually I fell back asleep. The next morning, I searched the house. The doors were locked, windows shut. No signs of forced entry, but the unease in my gut wouldn't go away. The next night, I stayed up late, reading with the TV on for background noise. Sometime around 2 a.m., I heard something different. Not footsteps. A whisper. A faint, rasping whisper. My name. I froze. It came from just outside my bedroom door. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I forced myself to grab the nearest thing, a heavy flashlight, then shot out of bed and yanked the door open. Nothing. I checked every room. Empty. I barely slept, and in the morning I convinced myself I'd been dreaming again. But the feeling wouldn't go away. That deep, unsettling sense that I wasn't alone. I decided to set up a camera. My uncle had an old one in storage, and I positioned it in the living room, aimed toward the staircase. If someone was coming inside, I'd catch them. That night, I locked every door, double-checked every window, and finally managed to drift off around 1 a.m. At 3:42 a.m., I woke up. Not to a sound, not to a whisper, to the feeling of breath on my face. I shot upright, my heart slammed against my ribs. I turned on the light, scanning the room. Empty. I jumped out of bed and checked the footage on the camera. The first few hours showed nothing, just the living room in darkness, the dim glow from the fireplace. Then at 3:41 a.m., the screen flickered for just a second. Then the footage continued as normal, except now the rocking chair in the corner was moving. Back and forth, back and forth. I hadn't touched that chair in days. I shut the laptop. I couldn't handle it. I felt sick. I knew then this wasn't my imagination. Something was here. I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere else to go, so I stayed. The next few nights were worse. The footsteps returned, now accompanied by faint knocks on the walls. The whispering grew more frequent, and the air in the house felt thick, heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. Then one night, I made a mistake. I spoke back. I don't know what came over me. Maybe exhaustion, maybe frustration. But when I heard the whispering, I snapped. "What do you want?" I demanded into the darkness. For a long moment, silence. Then the whisper returned. "Let me in." The air turned ice cold. My skin prickled. I ran, grabbed my keys, bolted outside, sat in my car until the sun rose. I didn't go back inside until daylight, and even then, I refused to be alone in the dark. The next morning, I called my uncle, told him everything. He went quiet for a long time. Then he sighed. "I didn't want to say anything," he admitted, "but I don't stay there in the winter for a reason." Apparently, I wasn't the first to hear things. Years ago, before my uncle bought it, the house had belonged to a man named Henry Lawson, a recluse, kept to himself, barely left the house. One winter, a snowstorm buried the property under several feet of ice. Lawson never made it out. The authorities didn't find him until months later. He was in the house the whole time, but not in one piece. The official report said wild animals had gotten in through a broken window, but my uncle said the state of the body was unnatural, twisted, almost like he had been torn apart from the inside out. I packed my bags that same day. I don't know what was in that house, and I don't want to know. All I know is that as I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, and I swear, in the upstairs window, I saw someone watching me go. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I had just moved into my new apartment. After months of searching, I finally found a place in a quiet neighborhood that seemed perfect. A cozy studio with large windows that let in plenty of sunlight, a small kitchen, and just the right amount of space for one. The landlord, a woman in her mid-50s named Ruth, seemed nice. She showed me around and gave me the keys without any trouble, mentioning that the building was mostly filled with older tenants. "It's a peaceful place," she'd said with a reassuring smile. "You'll love it here." I couldn't wait to settle in. After a chaotic few years of moving from place to place, this apartment felt like the stability I had been craving. I spent the first few days unpacking, getting familiar with the neighborhood, and enjoying the peace and quiet. At first, everything seemed perfect. The neighbors were quiet, the building was clean, and I had everything I needed within walking distance. But a few weeks in, things started to feel off. It started with small things at first. Things I could easily brush off as coincidences or my own forgetfulness. I would leave the kitchen for a few minutes to grab something from the living room, only to return and find the chair I had been sitting in slightly moved, or the kitchen counter wiped down when I hadn't cleaned it. At first, I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. Then, one evening, I came home to find the front door slightly ajar. I didn't remember leaving it unlocked, but I told myself I must have forgotten. Still, it made me uneasy. I checked the apartment thoroughly, making sure everything was in place. Nothing was missing, but the sense of discomfort lingered. That's when I started hearing it. The whispers. At night, when the apartment was quiet, I could hear soft voices. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the wind or maybe my neighbors talking, but as time went on, the voices became clearer. They weren't in a language I recognized, and they didn't seem to come from any specific direction. They were just there, like they were coming from inside the walls. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself that it was my imagination. I had recently moved to a new city, and the stress of the move could have been messing with my mind. But the whispers didn't stop. They got louder. One night, after hearing the voices for what felt like hours, I decided to confront whatever was making the noise. I got out of bed, turned on the lights, and walked through the apartment. I checked every room, the closets, even the bathroom. But there was no one there. No one but the whispers. I sat on the couch, trying to shake off the unease that was starting to grow inside me. I couldn't focus on anything. The voices seemed to be all around me, yet there was no clear source. My eyes darted from corner to corner, trying to find some explanation, but there was nothing. Just the silence between the whispers. The next day, I asked Ruth if she had heard anything strange. She looked at me with a kind smile and assured me that everything was normal in the building. "We've had some odd noises now and then," she said, "but it's just the building settling. You know, old pipes, thin walls. It happens." I nodded, though I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. That night, the whispers were worse. I could hear them clearly now, as if they were right next to me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I got up to check the locks on the windows and doors, but everything was secure. Still, the whispers grew louder, and for the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone in the apartment. I couldn't take it anymore. I called Ruth the next morning and told her I was considering moving out. She listened patiently and then made an offer that I couldn't refuse. "Why don't you let me help?" she said. "I know a few things about the building. If you like, I could have someone come by and check it out for you. We've had some strange things happen in the past, but nothing that couldn't be explained." I was skeptical, but I agreed. I was at my wit's end, and I was willing to try anything at that point. Ruth told me to expect someone later that afternoon. When the man arrived, I was caught off guard. He wasn't what I expected. He looked like an ordinary handyman, wearing faded jeans and a flannel shirt. But there was something about him that gave me an odd feeling in my stomach. His eyes were dark, his gaze intense. "Ruth called me," he said in a low voice. "I hear you've been hearing some things." I nodded, unsure how to proceed. I didn't know what to tell him, so I simply led him to the apartment. As we walked through the rooms, I watched him closely. He moved with a quiet confidence, running his fingers over the door frames, checking the corners of the ceiling. After a few minutes, he turned to me. "It's an old building," he said. "Things like this happen sometimes. But there's something else here, something that doesn't quite belong." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped into the small hallway and started examining the walls. When he reached the far corner, he stopped. He reached up and tapped on the wall with his knuckles, then frowned. "This isn't right," he muttered to himself. I stood frozen, watching him. He turned to me, his face serious. "Do you know what's behind this wall?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, I've never had reason to look." He placed his hand on the wall and pushed. The wall gave way slightly, and I heard a strange, scraping sound coming from inside. My heart began to race as he continued to press. Finally, the wall shifted, revealing a small hidden door that had been covered with drywall. The man looked at me, his face pale. "I think you should sit down," he said quietly. I obeyed, sitting on the couch, not knowing what to expect. He carefully opened the door, revealing a narrow, dark space behind the wall. The air smelled stale, and I could hear a faint rustling sound coming from within. "Whatever's in here," he said, his voice low and tense. "It's been here a long time." I tried to calm myself, but the fear was overwhelming. The man stepped into the dark space, his flashlight casting an eerie glow on the walls. For a few long minutes, I couldn't hear anything, and then I heard him speak, his voice barely audible. "You need to come here." I stood up, my legs shaking, and walked toward the door. As I peered inside, I saw what he was pointing at. There, lying on the ground, was a small bundle of old, rotting clothing, and next to it, a small, weathered notebook. The pages were yellow and torn, but I could make out some words written in faded ink. "Help me." The man picked up the notebook and handed it to me. I opened it carefully, trying to steady my hands. It was filled with writings, drawings, and strange symbols. Most of it was incomprehensible, but one page caught my eye. It was a map of the apartment building. The lines were drawn in dark, angry strokes with one marked location, my apartment. "Who did this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he walked back to the small doorway and began to cover it up again, sealing the hidden space. "You should leave," he said softly, "and don't come back here alone." I didn't need any more convincing. I grabbed my things and left the apartment that day. I never went back, and I never spoke to Ruth again. The last I heard, the building was condemned. They tore it down brick by brick and replaced it with a new complex. But every now and then I hear stories from people who used to live there about strange noises, hidden doors, and things that shouldn't have been. And sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I still hear the whispers. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was a cold winter night, the kind that sinks deep into your bones, even when you're wrapped in layers of blankets and thick woolen socks. Emily had just returned to her small, 2-bedroom cottage in the woods after a long day at work. The sun had already set by the time she pulled into her gravel driveway, the tall trees surrounding her home casting long shadows over the snow-covered ground. Her cottage was a quaint little place, nestled in a clearing among the trees, far enough from the town to feel isolated, but close enough that a grocery run wasn't too much of a hassle. It was a quiet life, one that Emily had chosen after leaving behind the chaos of city living. She preferred the solitude, the stillness of nature, and the occasional visits from deer or birds to the constant noise and bustle she had grown up with. As she stepped inside, she locked the door behind her and hung up her coat. The warmth of the house was a welcome relief from the chill outside. Emily flicked on the lights and walked to the kitchen, where she heated up some leftovers from the night before. Her cat, a large gray tabby named Clyde, was sprawled out on the windowsill, staring out into the dark. "Hey, buddy," she said, reaching over to pet him. He purred, his eyes narrowing in contentment, but he didn't take his gaze away from the window. Emily smiled and shook her head. "You're such a weirdo." After finishing her dinner, she settled onto the couch with a book, enjoying the quiet of the evening. It was one of those nights where the outside world felt far away, and the only sounds were the occasional creaks of the house and the low hum of the furnace. Clyde eventually hopped off the windowsill and curled up beside her, as he always did when he was done with his vigil. Emily turned the pages of her book, the soft light of the lamp casting a warm glow over the room. But then, just as she was getting lost in her reading, a strange sound broke the silence. A tapping. At first, she thought it might have been the wind. The branches of the trees outside often scraped against the windows during storms, making eerie, rhythmic tapping noises. But this was different. It was too precise, too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Emily sat up straighter, her eyes darting toward the window. Clyde, sensing her unease, lifted his head and stared at the door leading to the hallway. The tapping continued, faint but unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. She held her breath, straining her ears. It wasn't the wind. Someone, or something, was at her door. A surge of fear rose in her chest, and her mind raced with possibilities. Was it someone from town? A late-night visitor? But who would come here at this hour? Her closest neighbors were a few miles away, and no one had called ahead to let her know they were stopping by. Tentatively, she got up from the couch, her bare feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. The tapping continued, though it was now accompanied by something else. Footsteps. Slow, measured steps, as if someone was pacing back and forth just beyond her door. She moved cautiously to the hallway and stood still, her heart thudding in her chest. She didn't want to open the door. She didn't want to know what was on the other side. But she had to be sure. She had to see. Her hand gripped the cold doorknob and she hesitated for a moment. The footsteps stopped. Everything was silent. Then, with a trembling hand, she turned the knob and slowly opened the door, half expecting someone or something to burst through at any moment. But there was nothing there. No one in the hallway. No one outside. Just the darkness of the night creeping in from the edges of the porch. Emily stepped back into the living room, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. It was nothing. Her mind had been playing tricks on her, but as she turned to walk back to the couch, she froze. The light on the hallway table was flickering. It hadn't been before. She hadn't turned it on, but it was on now. Faint, weak flickers like a candle in a draft. She swallowed hard. Okay, that's strange. The flickering grew more intense, and for a moment, Emily wondered if the bulb was just about to go out. But then she noticed something else. The shadows in the hallway seemed to move, shifting in ways they shouldn't. Her stomach twisted. She rushed back to the door and slammed it shut, locking it, even though she was alone. She glanced toward the windows. The snow outside had started to fall heavily, and the whole world was blanketed in white. It looked like a peaceful night from the outside, but Emily couldn't shake the sense that something was terribly wrong. Minutes turned into hours, and Emily tried her best to shake off the feeling of dread creeping up her spine. But it was no use. She couldn't stop thinking about the tapping, the footsteps, the lights flickering. Her mind kept returning to it, replaying it over and over again like a broken record. Later that night, when she finally lay down to sleep, Emily heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. But this time it wasn't at the door. It was coming from inside the house. Her heart raced as the tapping continued, each tap louder than the last. Emily's eyes shot open in the dark, and she strained her ears, trying to locate the source of the sound. It was coming from somewhere upstairs, the floorboards creaking under the weight of slow, deliberate footsteps, the unmistakable sound of something or someone moving through her home. She froze, unsure of what to do. Should she call the police? But who would be up here? Who would be inside her house without her hearing them? Tap, tap, tap. The footsteps came closer and the air grew colder, a chill that settled deep into her bones. Every instinct in her body told her to stay as still as possible, not to make a sound. She wasn't sure how long she lay there, paralyzed with fear, listening to the steady rhythm of footsteps drawing closer and closer. It stopped, just outside her bedroom door. Silence fell over the house, thick and suffocating. Then the door handle began to turn. I'll continue the rest of the story next time if you like. Would you like me to keep going, or would you prefer a different direction?
Story number 8.
It was the middle of January, the kind of cold that bit at your bones and made you feel like you'd never be warm again. My name is Claire, and at the time, I was a 22-year-old college student renting a small one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't anything fancy, just a cheap place that fit my budget, but it was quiet, which I liked. My apartment complex sat near the woods, far enough from campus that most students wouldn't bother living there, but close enough that I could bike to class in about 15 minutes. The area was mostly filled with older folks, quiet professionals, and a few scattered young tenants like me. It felt safe until the night everything changed. I had always been a light sleeper, but that night I woke up to something I couldn't quite explain. A faint noise. Not loud, not even distinct, just off. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding a little harder than it should have for a noise so subtle. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again. A soft, dragging sound like something being pulled across my carpet. My breath hitched, and I froze. I lived alone. Slowly, I reached for my phone on the nightstand and turned on the flashlight, sweeping it across the room. My bedroom door was still shut, just like I had left it. Nothing seemed out of place, but my gut twisted. I debated whether I was just imagining things. Maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe I was being paranoid. Just as I started to relax, the noise came again, closer this time. I jolted upright and aimed the flashlight toward the foot of my bed. Nothing, but I knew I had heard it. I forced myself to get out of bed, my feet cold against the hardwood floor as I moved cautiously toward the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening. Silence. Holding my breath, I unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. My living room was bathed in darkness, shadows stretching across the walls. Something felt wrong. My apartment was small enough that I should have been able to see anything out of place immediately. I stepped out, my bare feet silent against the floor, my phone's flashlight my only source of light. I scanned the room. My front door was still locked, the deadbolt secured. The windows were shut. Everything looked normal. Then I noticed it. The closet door near the entrance. It was open. I never left it open. Ever. A slow chill crept down my spine as I stared at the dark gap, the empty void between the door and the frame. It had been shut when I went to bed. I was sure of it. I felt the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone, that something was there. I took a shaky step forward, my breath shallow. The air felt heavy, charged like the moment before a storm. I wanted to run, but I had to know. I reached out, fingers trembling, and pulled the door open the rest of the way. Nothing. Just my coats, a few boxes, and the mop I kept tucked inside. But the feeling of being watched remained, pressing against me like unseen hands. I shut the closet door quickly, locking it as if that would somehow keep whatever I felt from reaching me. My stomach churned, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. I checked my apartment twice, triple-checked the locks, and finally, after an hour of sitting on my couch with a kitchen knife clutched in my hand, I convinced myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe I'd left the closet open. Maybe the noise had been my imagination. I went back to bed, eventually drifting into a restless sleep. But the next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. In the carpet just near my bed was a long, faint drag mark, like something or someone had been crawling. The next few nights, things got worse. I would wake up at odd hours, heart pounding, the sensation of being watched so intense that I couldn't breathe. I started hearing the noise more frequently, the dragging sound. Sometimes it was close, sometimes farther away. I stopped sleeping. I stopped turning off the lights at night. Then, one night, I woke up unable to move. I was lying on my back, my body completely frozen, my breathing shallow. Sleep paralysis. I had heard of it before, but I had never experienced it. My eyes darted around the room, panic gripping me like a vice. That's when I saw it. At the foot of my bed, something crouched in the darkness. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its fingers stretched into sharp points that curled against the floor. Its face, or what should have been its face, was an empty void, shifting like a smudged reflection in a dirty mirror. It was watching me. A horrible, wet, dragging sound filled the room as it began to move closer, pulling itself toward me with slow, deliberate motions. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. The closer it got, the more I felt something pressing against my mind, something old and hungry. I wanted to close my eyes, but I couldn't. I had to watch as it crawled onto my bed, looming over me, its face inches from mine. The shadows around it seemed to pulse, distorting the air. Then, in a voice that wasn't a voice, a sound that slithered into my brain like a whisper from the depths of something ancient, it spoke. "You left the door open." Then, just like that, it was gone. I gasped, suddenly able to move, scrambling backward against my headboard. My room was empty, but the closet door was open again. I left that apartment the next day, breaking my lease and crashing at a friend's place until I found a new home. I never went back, never even gathered the rest of my things. Whatever was in that apartment, whatever I let in when I left that door open, I wasn't going to give it a chance to follow me. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear it. That awful, wet, dragging sound. Story the end.